Stephen King has seen it all: the good, the bad, and the downright horrifying. So when the king of horror says you can't do much better than these films, you know he means business. When Stephen King calls a movie his favorite of all time, you know it's worth a look. That film is Sorcerer, a 1977 thriller by William Friedkin, the director of The Exorcist. And no, it's not about wizards. Sorcerer is a brutal reimagining of Wages of Fear, following four desperate men transporting unstable dynamite through a treacherous Latin American jungle. The production alone was pure hell. 50 crew members were hospitalized with injuries, malaria, or worse. Friedkin himself lost 50 pounds and called it the toughest film he ever made. But Sorcerer wasn't just grueling to shoot, it was slaughtered at the box office. It needed $45 million to break even, but only made $9 million worldwide. Why? Because it came out a month after Star Wars. Editor Bud Smith didn't hold back. Star Wars made our film look like an amateurish piece of shit. But Stephen King is still a die-hard fan, calling Sorcerer the best film of all time. This suspense horror masterpiece follows a wife and mistress who plot to murder a loathed school principal. They think they've pulled off the perfect crime until the body mysteriously disappears. Les Diaboliques has one of the first ever twist endings that forces you to rethink everything you've seen. Stephen King calls it as terrifying now as it was back in 1955. Henri-Georges Clouzot snatched the film rights to the original novel just hours before Alfred Hitchcock could, and the film's shocking twist is rumored to have inspired Psycho. Even Hitchcock was a fan. The film also comes with real-life tragedy. Vera Clouzot, who plays the fragile wife, died of a heart attack just 5 years after the movie was released, eerily similar to her character's weak heart in the film. The Changeling follows a grieving composer who moves into a mansion haunted by dark secrets. Based on real events at the Henry Treat Rogers Mansion in Denver, the film's writers spent 6 months researching paranormal case histories to craft its chilling story. Despite its modest $6.6 million budget, The Changeling became a masterclass in atmospheric horror, earning praise from legends like Martin Scorsese and Guillermo del Toro. Even Neve Campbell called it the scariest movie she'd ever seen. King called it terrifying, praising George C. Scott and perhaps his last great screen role. He added, "There are no monsters bursting from chests. Just a child's ball bouncing down a flight of stairs was enough to scare the daylights out of me." A 1957 British classic you've probably never seen, directed by Jacques Tourneur. This creepy folk horror precursor follows an American professor investigating a devil-worshipping cult leader who summons a massive demon to rip his enemies to shreds. King calls it understated horror, and he's right. Jacques Tourneur didn't even want to show the monster. The studio overruled him, sneaking in a full reveal during post-production. The director hated it, but horror fans loved it. The demon became an iconic 1950s horror image, and Night of the Demon is now regarded as one of the scariest films of its time. Even Martin Scorsese put it on his list of the 11 scariest horror movies ever. Released in 1960, this British sci-fi horror flick is as unsettling as it gets. An entire village mysteriously blacks out, and when everyone wakes up, the women are pregnant. Their blonde-haired, glowing-eyed offspring is creepy as hell and equipped with terrifying psychic powers. King loves it for good reason. This adaptation of John Wyndham's The Midwich Cuckoos is a masterclass in quiet dread. Even the critics agree. Village of the Damned boasts a 93% score on Rotten Tomatoes. If John Carpenter's 1995 remake left a bad taste in your mouth, do yourself a favor and watch the original. As King himself puts it, you can't do much better. He's right. This film will haunt you long after its eerie 77 minutes are up. Duel is Steven Spielberg's first film, shot in just 12 days in 1971 for American TV. It's a stripped-down, nail-biting thriller. One man, one truck, one fight to the death. King calls Duel Spielberg's most inventive film. No frills, no gimmicks, just pure tension. Based on a short story by Richard Matheson, Duel follows a business commuter hunted by an unseen, psychotic truck driver. You never see the villain, just a flash of his boots or hands on the wheel. Spielberg knew this fear of the unknown was terrifying and reused the idea for Jaws just 4 years later. The two films are so connected that Spielberg even reused Duel's truck sound effect for the shark sinking to the ocean floor in Jaws. But Duel came first. This brutal B-movie cult classic follows a young man tormented by a psychotic hitchhiker, played by Rutger Hauer. King praised Hauer's performance as the killer John Ryder, calling it amazing, and he's not alone. Christopher Nolan calls The Hitcher one of his guilty pleasures, describing it as mind-bendingly arbitrary. He even said Hauer's performance here rivals Blade Runner as his finest Euro-psycho role. But Hauer didn't just act. He did his own insane stunt driving, leaving even the professionals stunned. Co-star C. Thomas Howell admitted Hauer's intensity was so terrifying he was scared of him on and off set. This R-rated psychological horror follows a man who murders his entire family, moves to a new town, marries a widow, and prepares to do it all over again. It's inspired by the real-life case of John List, a suburban dad who killed his family and vanished under a false identity. Terry O'Quinn, yes, John Locke from Lost, plays the charming but unhinged stepfather. This role didn't really launch him, though. He later admitted that it made people call me up to play more psychotics, and I didn't want to just become that. The movie was first sold as a psychological thriller, but when audiences shrugged, the studio rebranded it as a slasher. It still bombed, grossing just $2.5 million at the box office. Critics loved it, though, and The Stepfather built a cult following over time. This 2016 thriller stars Brian Cox and Emile Hirsch as coroners who discover that their latest body, a seemingly normal Jane Doe, is anything but. What starts as a routine examination turns into a nightmare of supernatural horror. King called it visceral horror to rival Alien and early Cronenberg, and warned viewers, watch it, but not alone. Coming off the success of Troll Hunter, director André Øvredal wanted to prove he could deliver something beyond found footage movies, and he proved it all right. Guillermo del Toro's gothic romance was doomed from the start. King called it gorgeous and just fucking terrifying, but most audiences never gave it a chance. Why? Blame the marketing. Universal sold Crimson Peak as a horror film, showcasing its ghosts, creepy visuals, and jump scares. The problem? It's not a horror movie. Del Toro warned them, promote the romance and mystery, not the horror. But Universal didn't listen. The movie hit theaters at the worst possible time. Ridley Scott's The Martian was dominating the PG-13 adult market, and Crimson Peak didn't stand a chance. With a $55 million budget, it flopped hard. Critics weren't kind either. Reviewers expecting cheap scares dinged it for its lack of them. But that was never the point. One of Stephen King's latest picks is Late Night with the Devil, a 2023 indie horror film by Colin and Cameron Cairns. King got an early screener from one of the producers, and his reaction? Absolutely brilliant. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Shot on a shoestring budget in Melbourne, Late Night with the Devil feels like a lost gem from the 1970s. It's a throwback to classic horror. Think The Exorcist era chills, not today's body horror. The story follows a late-night talk show in the 70s that slowly descends into pure hell on live TV. The setup's simple, the execution is terrifying, and it became an instant festival hit before grossing over $15 million at the box office. Not bad for a tiny film shot in an Australian warehouse. King isn't a big fan of any Children of the Corn adaptations. Responding to a Twitter thread about one version he especially dislikes, King instead recommended Plane, a 2023 B-movie action flick starring Gerard Butler, calling it authentic fight or flight material. The plot's simple. Butler plays Brody Torrance, a pilot who crash lands on a war-torn island and has to team up with an accused murderer to save his passengers from a rebel militia. It's low budget, just $25 million, but it punched way above its weight, raking in $75 million at the box office. What makes Planes special? The sweat, the exhaustion. It's all real. Shot on location in Puerto Rico, the cast endured the heat and humidity for authentic grit, and the action's even more legit. Former Navy SEALs worked as stunt performers and consultants to make every fight scene hit harder. Slamming Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill as an empty, narcissistic, and unimportant film in Entertainment Weekly, King drew contrast with Clint Eastwood's Mystic River. Released in 2003, it's a dark, emotional crime thriller about three childhood friends reunited by tragedy, a young woman's murder. King praised Mystic River for doing what movies are supposed to do, building characters and telling a story. With its razor-sharp script and strong performances, King wrote, "The movie is an absolute joy." It won 2 Oscars out of 6 nominations, and Sean Penn and Tim Robbins walked away with the gold. Eastwood wasn't just the director, he was the heart and soul of this movie. When the studio pushed to film in Toronto to save money, Eastwood said no. He fought to shoot in Boston, where the story is set. And he didn't stop there. Eastwood narrated the teaser trailer himself and even composed the film's score. Directed by a young Francis Ford Coppola all the way back in 1963, this indie horror flick was made in 9 days on a $42,000 budget. For context, Coppola's latest, Megalopolis, cost $120 million and flopped. According to King, Coppola was working on one of Roger Corman's notoriously low-budget films when he convinced Corman to let him make a movie on the side, using his crew, his equipment, and sheer audacity. The result was Dementia 13, a black-and-white psychological horror film packed with atmosphere and gut-churning dread. King swears it makes Psycho and Night of the Living Dead look tame, calling Dementia 13 a movie that matters. Stephen King thinks The Way of the Gun is a real classic. Never heard of it? You're not alone. Released in 2000, this gritty crime thriller flopped, grossing just $13 million on an $8.5 million budget, and critics were not kind. Starring Benicio del Toro and Ryan Philippe as 2 drifters who kidnap a surrogate mother, the film strips away all sympathy and dares you to follow characters who don't give a damn about being likable. McQuarrie said, "Is it flawed? Sure, but it's sincere." The story behind the film is as brutal as the plot. After winning an Oscar for The Usual Suspects, McQuarrie thought he could make anything. But Hollywood said otherwise. Fox literally told him to get fucked. So, unemployed and fed up, he made The Way of the Gun with total creative control.